So our theme this week then is Edinburgh Castle, and I'm out in Princess Street Gardens and I'm going to do a number of studies. I'm going to use ink and wash. I'm starting with some wash, a bit of sponge and a tray of wash, which is dilute ink, and just thinking, trying to join things up with what you were doing last week, those fantastic paintings, Finding the Figure. Edinburgh Castle is this really striking edifice up on the rock that is against the light sky very often, and you see it from all sorts of angles. So I thought it might be interesting to try and think in terms of making a picture where the castle isn't necessarily that obvious. So as I came into the gardens, I was struck by looking through these amazing trees at the castle. So that's the first image that I'm going to work on. I'm going to produce a series of studies in ink and wash, and then from that try and make my mind up about what to paint or what to go on to do. So I'm using the side of the sponge just to block in basically the dark shape. When I look with my eyes half closed, that castle is a dark shape up on the rock. So I've just really done a big area of tone, of wash. It's complicated, Edinburgh Castle, and I think the idea of trying to set it within a picture is worth considering, so that you don't necessarily get hung up on how do I make it exactly like Edinburgh Castle, but that you're thinking much more in terms of picture making. What do you want people to see? What do they see first? What's the mood? And I think Edinburgh Castle is this incredibly dramatic site up on the rock, and that would be a good thing to aim for. So I put down some wash. I'll need to let that dry. But although I don't want to get too caught up in all the complications, the walls and the grassy banks and the windows and the chimneys, I'm just wiping off a bit of wash with a hand towel to get a little bit of that variation, so that it's not a completely solid lump. But I'm going to, when that's dry, draw into it with my stick and my undiluted ink. And just by doing this with a sort of big implement, as it were, this bit of hand towel, I've got a bit of a guide as well as creating some variety. So I'll let that dry. I'll pause while that dries, and I'll get out some undiluted ink and draw into this. And of course I've got this veil of trees in front, which I'm going to put on as well. So that's more or less dry. It's a bit of a damp day today, so it's taking its time to dry. I've now got my pot of ink. I've got a couple of sticks. One is pretty thick and the other is quite fine. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to look through the trees at the castle, and I'm going to do a bit of drawing of the castle using my fine stick. And maybe I don't want to go straight for the edge. I just like to see how the stick behaves first. So I'll just do a little bit of that wall. Now I've drawn this castle quite a few times, and I know it's very complicated, but I also know that nobody really knows what it looks like exactly, and I'm not too worried about misrepresenting it at least in terms of windows and walls. So I want to keep that fine. That got a bit thick and heavy. Anyway, I'm getting on some outlines of the various buildings, and I've got a plan then to work with a much thicker line for the trees, because actually, this is terribly shaky, but as I start to define using this line, It's not as good, is it? It was really great when it was just this suggestion of the mass, the grey mass on the hill. But I'm hopeful, I mean that's maybe just taught me something about what I would go on and do, but I am hopeful that if I put on some much heavier lines for the trees, that subtle effect that I created just with the wash will kind of come back. So maybe I should be a little bit cautious about windows. I mean, the thing that I think is worth trying to get from this viewpoint is this is the front of that. These buildings are funny, they just look like your average Edinburgh tenement. They're not quite as romantic as they ought to be. But got a little blob there. At this point here is the gable end of that building. So I think that's worth getting in, just thinking about what you select and what you might ignore. I think that gives a bit of form to that building and therefore makes it all a bit more interesting. It gives the whole image a bit more depth rather than just having this potentially flat shape against the sky. So modelling some of those buildings ever so slightly I think is worth doing. Then below the wall we've got some sort of lawn, and then we've got a new wall over here. But it's funny because it's, as you draw it, you know, it's a bit like some of these Escher bits of architecture. It really doesn't add up that easily. So it's very easy to get lost, but at the same time it also means that I don't think it has to make too much sense. You know, if you try and be too definite about how things connect, you may just be making life hard for yourselves. So I'm not going to do the windows yet. I'm going to go straight onto the trees. So that's possibly more difficult than castle, but I think having a big stick is an idea. And again, these trees, who knows what these trees are like really. So I've gone straight for the ink with the trees. Part of me is tempted to try charcoal just to have an easier life, but I think if I was to try for the charcoal and an easier life, I wouldn't do anything quite so decisive. So I think I've just got to go with that. But it is helpful having this thicker stick because it makes the tree element of my composition different from the castle element. I think it's raining now, so I'm getting drops of rain. Anyway, so the trees, it seems to me, actually the other thing that's happening is the ink is running down, so the tips of my branches aren't quite so dark, and the more I load on the ink, the more it runs down the page. Never mind. So the trees have lighter sides and a bit of colour, so I might do something with that. You know, if I was to let this dry, I could put some pastel and some chalk on top. But for the time being, I just want to get the feel of the difference between these solid trees and the fainter greyer castle in the background. So that's what I'll do, and then I'll have a quick go at a few windows. And I think I'll stop because this ink is running down the page, and I can only go so far with that tree. And what I really want is some quite strong contrast against the sky, because I think when I do that, that helps the castle recede a bit. So there we go, there's one idea. I think what I would do differently, or what I would do in addition to this, might be to get a bit of colour on the tree. I've only got one tree, which is a shame. It'd be nice to have more than one tree. There are trees coming over this side. I'm not going to do them yet. I will join that up so they can run down. Yeah, so I would get a bit of colour onto the trees, I would get a few more windows, which I'll just quickly do, just to see what that's like. But I really want to do quite thin lines. The trouble with the windows is once I start, I better do a few. I can't just do 2 windows. Maybe once I've got some windows, these walls might need to be developed. So you can see how that can kind of move on from the strong contrast of the tree into more subtle changes. And I think, yes, colour on the trees is one thing I do, and the other thing I would do, and I don't know that I want to do it with ink, but I would possibly do it with charcoal, would be to get something more of the texture of the rock. I'll do that with a thin stick for now. So that's one possibility that I've seen wandering around the gardens. I'm now going to move along to the other end and look for something different. I've just paused here, a little bit further along Princess Street Gardens, to take in this view where you've got the full length of the castle. But actually, because I'm less interested in this, I've decided, because of the way it's skylined, stands out, it's just the castle, and I'm looking for something to combine the castle with, to lose the castle or to work it against. So I've come to the other end of the gardens, and I'm down at the lower level. So we've got the kind of full length of the castle that I saw from the middle, but I've also got some other protagonists in this, what could be this composition. I think I want to start with the rock because that's really going to give it its prominent scale. But I've also got this sculpture in front, and then there are those silver birches. So I'm not sure my paper, or I've drawn too big to get it all on. Either I need a very long sort of letterbox format, or I don't worry, I change it a bit. And then the sculpture's down here. I must go and find out who the sculpture is. And the trees are there, so this is kind of where it all stops. I don't really like the modern sculpture, so I'm just ignoring it. I'm ignoring it, I know it's there, but I'm ignoring it partly because I don't think I could make much sense of it. You put something in a drawing and it doesn't make sense. People will look at it and think, what's that? But I want them to look at the castle and think, wow, what an extraordinary edifice. So here's my hand towel again. I might draw a little bit of that. And I think what I'll do with this drawing, I'm using the ink and wash again because I like its decisive quality. But I really liked what I started with last time because it was so subtle and a little bit mysterious. And so I think to maintain that quality with this drawing, so this is just bits that I'm picking off and spreading out just to knock back the white where the grass is. With this drawing, I think when it's dry, I'm going to work into it with charcoal first. So let's pause and let that dry. So I think that's dry enough. I've got a thin stick of willow charcoal, I've got a thick stick as well. But I'll start with a thin stick. And I think this time I am actually just going to go for the outline. And as is often the best way with ink and wash, although I put down some shapes with the sponge and the wash, of course when I get to drawing in a more definite way with my charcoal, I discover that I've missed all sorts of things out, or I've mainly missed things out really, or changed scale. So I've got to find a way of adapting. I want to keep the spontaneity and the decisive quality of the wash. So there's no point, if I start making all sorts of little changes, I'll lose that decisiveness. So I'm going to have to work with what's there. And if through this sort of study, the great thing about ink and wash is it's so quick. So if through this study I discover certain things which are really worth making something of, like this building here facing us, then in the study I've not just got a feeling for the composition I want, I've also got a way of identifying certain things to include, to make more of, to make a focus, all that sort of thing. It's funny, the light keeps changing, but I feel like I'm getting a little bit more colour and light over this side. So that's drawing into it, not sticking with exactly the shapes that I laid down in wash. And now I think I'll go from the castle to my sculpture of this woman and children. Is she a teacher, I wonder? So I'm getting the sculpture down with the figures in the foreground, and then I'm going to decide what to do about the trees. So I think that's quite a nice example really of selecting. There's so much out there that I really want to get these silver birch trees, their whiteness, their creaminess, and this sculpture set against the castle on its rock. So we've got some white trees, we've also got a couple of darker trees. I think the way these two trees, dark trees up there behind the birches, I don't think that's a very good design. I'm going to ignore them. But I do want the light trees and the dark trees. Not too regular, hopefully. So that's all just done with the charcoal. So because that's dry, I'll just quickly try a bit of pastel to get a hint of colour. I wasn't planning to get into a lot of colour, but I think actually it's probably worth getting some colour behind these trees. I'm just getting a kind of wash of brown. I haven't gone for the darkest brown. Oh, this is going to get complicated. I didn't mean it to be complicated anyway. Get a bit of that on. Probably need to smudge it a bit. Yeah, okay, never mind. Let's just try it. Let's just go for colour. And then we've got some greens. I mean, at least it's a nice limited palette. But I'm sort of only slightly regretting this part because I wasn't planning to get into lots of different things. I just wanted to particularly bring out the trees and the figure in the foreground. But of course, as you know, once you start doing colour, things get more and more complicated, so I'm not allowed to get complicated, just have to be quick and decisive. And also, I don't want to lose too much of the, as I've been describing, the directness of the ink and the wash. Okay, so I wanted to get the light trees, that was the plan. I'm sticking to. But of course I think I realised in a way, in order for some of these light trees to really stand out, they probably need to be against something a bit darker, which is why I was putting on the pastel. Yeah, that's giving me a bit of an idea. I think the thing to do next really would be to rub a lot of that in, possibly rub it in with a bit of charcoal. Let's try a bit just around here, just to see how that can work. So what I would be doing is getting a bit more charcoal there.
I'm always envious of people that can paint or draw. Nice and relaxing.
Yeah. And actually the wash makes a difference. So it's not just that I'm rubbing in charcoal to a plain paper surface. The wash actually gives it a bit of a tooth. And then I can get some much sharper, brighter effects with my lighter. This is just a bit of white chalk. And then I would come back again with my charcoal and find this sculpture. So the things I wanted to point out, I've got a different view now. So that's new material, but still thinking of this idea of not just the castle, but setting against things, and also I've pointed out how I've left things out. So I'm picture making. I'm including the things that I think make an interesting picture. I'm leaving out the things that aren't part of that idea. And I might even be rearranging things. So on the email I've included some images of work by various artists. There's Michael Andrews, who did this amazing long thin painting that includes the castle and Victoria Street, and it's actually a view that you can't see. He has put things together in such a way, he's made his own composition, which is entirely believable, but which is actually an accumulation of different views. And of course that's what we can do as artists. And it's not untruthful, because actually, I don't know, that argument's run out, but I think there is definitely a truth in the way an artist can rearrange his material in order to convey something about how extraordinary this castle is, where it appears in all sorts of different places and surprises us. So right, I'm going to stop this one, and I've got one more view. I'm going to go to Westport and look between the streets and the buildings to see how it appears from that point of view. Okay, so just one more view for a bit of variety. This probably isn't the most picturesque view, but I'm always struck by it very often at night. So looking down this West Spittal Street, I think the thing is because it's this contrast between the streets, the tenements, and then this rock. So, as I say, although it's not the most picturesque view, I think what it says about the castle. So I'll try a different approach. I'll try some lines first and see what that gives me. Sticking with the ink because it's so decisive. If I'm worried about making too many strong lines, I can let the ink run out of it. And yeah, it's the contrast of the buildings, the streets, and then that rock. And maybe it's to do with perspective as well. The perspective of the buildings. The buildings frame the castle and its rock, and also the perspective lines. They all point at the castle and say, "Look at that." So, starting with a few lines, leaving things out. I'm not interested in cars really. I am quite interested in the street lamps, because again I think they lead our eye to the castle. But as I've said, it's not even the castle, actually, it's particularly the rock. It's that phenomenal lump of rock bang in the middle of the city. So do a few lines, and for speed and for interest, I'll then just put the wash straight on. I won't even worry about letting the ink dry, just to see what happens. And I think on the email, hopefully I will have put, there's some great paintings by Henry Kondraki, another local lad, where he's got these kind of, well, I think I can think of one I've seen with snow, but again it's the appearance of this rock and this castle at the top of the painting above the people that he's managed to bring out so well. Yeah, and there's the road going up. Okay, so let's leave that like that. I've made sure I've got the bits of perspective, and it's a frame. So I'll pause while I get some wash. So because my ink is still wet, I suspect the wash is going to pick it up and it'll bleed a bit. So get that blocked in. Some filling in of the walls. The castle is, as ever, this sort of silhouette against the sky. I'm often struck by this view at night because the castle can be lit up, and it's then a light shape against a dark sky. So that's a bit of wash going on. What will I do with the buildings? Maybe I'll just get a suggestion of the windows or something, just so that I'm treating the buildings differently from the castle. And then I would let that dry and draw into that with something. That's not too bad. Maybe a little bit of spreading it around, get some of the texture of the rock. And then it would be quite nice to get some of the finer detail of the castle, which I'll do now.
Yeah, it's very, very simple. But then again, to be fair,
With a little bit of charcoal. And then that's probably it. So I hope that what I've been demonstrating then is going to be sufficient to inspire you. Keep talking while I do 300 windows and chimneys, windows and chimneys. These are the details to add on. And again, see, there's this point where that building actually turns the corner, and I'd be quite keen to use that to get some depth into what is kind of a silhouette. It's funny, although it's a bit obscured, this is quite an interesting view, it turns out, I'm deciding. So in this video I've only gone as far as giving you some demonstrations of the ink and wash and a bit of chalk and pastel, seeing things from different points of view. I hope that's enough to get you started. I dare say you'll either come out in the wind and rain and have a go yourselves, or you might find some images. But I think it would be good if I challenged you to not go for the obvious views just of Edinburgh Castle on its own, but to look at ways of, none of that's going on, is it? Yeah. Look at ways of, think of picture making. So try hiding it, try combining it with other elements that compose it in some way or balance it. Okay, so we'll see some sketches tomorrow. Bye bye.